So put your practice page aside and get out your coloring sheet. And we're going to start off with the spinach, which is number 11. That's that. That's okay. So I'm going to get myself resettled. And we are going to use a wet on wet technique because spinach is pretty uniform in color with just like, it's not so much that the color of the spinach is mottled and varied, but the spinach is kind of bumpy. So the bumps that are closer to you are in highlight, and the valleys created by the bumps are in shadow, so those look darker. So we are going to take our lighter green and paint the entire, all of the spinach leaves. Just paint the whole thing. And I want to say that the easiest thing to paint is something large. It might be more intimidating, but it is much easier. So, for example, if I was to ask you to write your name on a sheet of paper, you'd say, okay, no problem. And then if I asked you to write your name on a tiny little scrap of paper, then you'd have to try a little bit harder because it is harder. You need more, it's harder to see, it's harder to control your hand. The smaller something is, the harder it is. So we are painting fairly small with these, with each individual piece of produce. The whole sheet itself is pretty large, but if you look at the individual little guys, they're only a few inches big. So we're not going to put a ton of detail into each of these. We already have the basic shape drawn by the outline. And then even some of the interior details, like the spine of the leaf or the veins that run through it. So really, we could get away with just adding a single color to most of these, and it'd still look good in the end. But we're going to go and try to add just a bit of detail. You might be able to tell that this is a slightly nicer piece of paper than the one that we were using before for the practice. The practice one felt a little bit more plasticky. Like I don't think there is any plastic in it, but it's got more of a sheen. This is a little bit rougher and it absorbs the paper, the water a little bit better. And as I am painting, I painted the leaves on the left and worked my way to the right. And I can already see that the leaves on the left look a little bit different because they're drier. It's maybe too subtle to see. Oh yeah, you can see a little bit. So there is a little bit of the dry. On your own painting, you should probably start seeing that it's starting to dry. Now, what I want to do with the spinach is wet on wet. So I don't want it to be dry yet. So I got all that base layer down, but it's drying too quickly. So I'm just going to add another layer more quickly this time. So the paper's already a little bit wet. Now I'm just going to go over it once more and it will be even wetter. And I'm going to use a fairly heavily loaded brush. So there is a lot of paint on my paintbrush, more than I would sometimes use. And the second coat goes a lot faster. The first coat, you're trying to stay within the lines and get it really perfect and even. And the paper is bone dry, so it takes more of it. The second time, you don't have to be as perfect. and the paper is already a little bit wet, so it accepts the paint more rapidly. So if you're not done, that's okay, but I'm going to move on to the next step while mine is still wet. So my next step is to take these light green leaves and I am going to add dark green to them. So pause for a second. You can, I want you to watch what I'm doing, and then you can redo your light green layer and then add your dark layer after you see what I do. So while it's still wet, I am going to dip my paintbrush in my darker color, and I'm just going to tap it all over the spinach leaf. And it's not going to mix in completely evenly, and that's exactly what I want. I want to be mimicking that bumpy texture of the spinach. So you just tap it, and wherever you tap it, it will eventually kind of bleed out. It won't be this splotchy and blobby when it's dry. It will become more even. But you want to retain a little bit of that kind of haphazard bumpiness to it. And I'm going to add, I think, a little bit more of it to the smaller leaves, because I think that younger, smaller spinach leaves are often darker than the older leaves. Just like something that you would probably notice if you had the real example in your hand. Okay, so now that you see what I'm doing of adding this wet on wet, go ahead and add your own.